Obviously, respiratory infections are a big issue, that they want to keep their horses as healthy as possible. Um, and that's a big, thing for their respiratory tract if they're picking up respiratory infections from each other. And that's one of the reasons why racehorse trainers maybe don't allow as much social contact as we might like. But again, we actually found in both of the populations of horses that we looked at that increased social contact didn't have any increase in nasal discharge. So that was a really kind of nice finding as well that we can kind of put out to racehorse trainers um, to give them a wee bit of confidence, I suppose, to kind of improve or increase that amount of social contact that the horses can have.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of the Changing Rein podcast. When we think about racehorse welfare, we are inclined to think about things that happen on the racecourse, things like excessive use of the whip or whether the whip should be used at all, things like injuries and fatalities. But a day at the races is only a small part of a racehorse's life. This week's guest on the podcast is Dr. Rachel Annan, and Rachel wears two hats. She is an academic. She received her PhD from the University of Bristol in 2023, but she's also involved in the racing industry and has been for over 20 years. She has ridden out in Ireland, in Newmarket, in Dubai and in New Zealand. So she has seen a lot of the racing industry, the good and the bad. And she combined this practical knowledge and her academic interest into a PhD which looked at the welfare assessment of racehorses. And this is something that hadn't really been looked at before, and I think is a really, really important topic. In the episode, we talk about things like the role of staff in racehorse welfare. We talk about social contact. We talk about turnout, which is a theme that runs through a lot of episodes. If Rachel has one message, I believe it's that it's the small incremental changes that can make a big difference to the welfare of racehorses. And I think that's the challenge for the racing industry, to take up and make those small changes bit by bit to improve the welfare of racehorses. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of Changing Rein. This week's guest is Dr. Rachel Annan. I'm personally delighted that she's joined us in our virtual studio because Rachel's research focus is racehorse welfare. And of course, that's my area of interest too. Rachel and I have had plenty of chats up and down about different aspects of the welfare of racehorses, but I really wanted to introduce her to Karen first of all, and then to give her an opportunity to talk about her work on the podcast. So you're very welcome, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Maida. I'm delighted to be here.
Rachel, maybe just that first question. What brought you to racehorses? How did you end up doing what you're doing?
Yeah, it's probably not the most conventional path in terms of racehorses. So I don't come from a racing family or even an equine family, really. But I started riding sort of as a child and went to riding school and things like that. And then I actually went to CAFRE as a student in Enniskillen. So it's an equine college in Enniskillen with no racing experience whatsoever, and got involved in the racing yard there, which was just fantastic, and still is a fantastic resource for young people that are looking to get into the racing industry. So yeah, no, I had no background in racing or in the equine industry, and then just got completely bitten by the racing and thoroughbred bug, I guess. I was lucky enough to ride as an amateur in point-to-points for the college. And then after I'd done my degree in equine management at CAFRE, I went and done some travelling within the thoroughbred world. So I went to Dubai and worked for Drúba Selvaratnam, and yeah, I've just really been involved in the racing industry ever since.
I'm really interested in the ridden part of the welfare aspect of a horse's life, Rachel, and I'm just curious what you think about those early ridden experiences and the impact that can have on the horses in the future.
I think that it's something that is like has a massive impact on the individual horse. I think it's really complex as well, because as you say, it's whenever horses are started right at the beginning of their education. I think there's a big piece there in terms of the horse's lifetime welfare, is how they're started and what those early experiences are like. And I know from riding horses and race horses in particular, that the horses that have had good early experiences, they are, from a rider's point of view, they're easier to ride, and that they're more calm and things like that. And I think that those horses have better welfare because of those early good experiences, basically. And I think that goes across the board in lots of different things that we looked at in terms of the research, even in, like socialization of horses and things at an early stage, and then that's going to impact how they behave if they're turned out, and if they can be turned out because of those early experiences, and even the like stereotypical behaviors and things like that. I think they all begin at those early stages as well, and that has a big impact then on all sort of phases of their life as well. So I think I totally agree that the ridden side and just the early experiences of the horses have really impacts the rest of that horse's welfare through its life, basically. And maybe we are even missing a piece there, kind of thing, in terms of trying to put a bit of focus on that in that sort of space as well. And I'm looking at Meta, is probably, you would have more experience in that in the breeding and sales stage than I would have. But I definitely think that it's sort of a whole life. We have to look at all the different aspects and all the different stages of the horse's life to be able to kind of improve it across the board, I think.
I suppose what attracted me to your research, particularly the paper you published 2023, which we will put up on our show notes, is that you were looking at the daily life of a thoroughbred. I suppose there's been research in other areas, but not so much about that buzz phrase nowadays, the lived experience of a thoroughbred in a training yard. And I thought, because we love blue sky thinking here, I thought maybe we would take a day in the life of a racehorse and what you imagine the perfect day in the life of a racehorse might look like. And then we maybe go down some side roads along the way about what are the barriers and what are the strengths and what are the positives that we could incorporate to make that a reality.
There obviously are bigger issues in terms of like race day fatalities and race day injuries and things like that, and welfare on race day is massive, and not least because that's when the public see racing and see race horses as well. So in terms of social license, it's really important. But if we think horses race on average 6 times in a season kind of thing, so there's 360 days then that we really wanted to focus on in terms of the welfare at home kind of thing, and what's going on for the majority of their kind of life. So what their life is like and what their welfare is like for those 360 days out of the year. And also that there actually is, research happening, I suppose, in terms of welfare on race day and fatalities and things like that. So yeah, I totally agree that some of those race day welfare issues are, are big and they're really, really important. But we definitely took the kind of view that there was some research in that area, and we were really keen to think about the majority of the horse's life when it's in training anyway, and look at So I suppose I find myself at a bit like yourself, maybe Maida, at a sort of a strange place between kind of the racing industry and the welfare, animal welfare, equine welfare space, I guess. And yeah, I got involved in a project at Bristol. So it's a big industry project basically that was looking to investigate racehorse welfare, and yeah, I seen it advertised and went for it and was really surprised really whenever I got it. But I suppose my experience in the racing industry really helped me, I suppose, to see things probably from both sides. And whenever we kind of, that racehorse welfare project at Bristol was looking at, trying to develop a welfare assessment protocol, or looking to see how we can assess welfare in racehorses, really. And yeah, it was a fantastic team, and we were really keen to look at the lives of the horse in training, and what was happening whenever they were at home. And we really wanted to look at those 360 days that they're not at the race course. And yeah, we done a big study. So we were looking at basically trying at the very beginning, trying to think about what can we even measure in terms of racehorse welfare? What can we measure in a racing yard as well? So we didn't ask the horses or the staff or the trainers to do anything sort of outside of what their normal day looked like. So we wanted to get a real, like a proper picture of what that looked like. And we looked at what measures had been used in other species in terms of welfare measures in other farm animal species and, captive animals species. And we really just tried to see what could be done in a racing yard. So we were looking at just sort of like testing out different measures that impact a horse in its daily life. And alongside that, looking at the different measures, we also done kind of a large behavioural study. So myself and Mathilde Van Chalon basically done scan sampling. So it was basically trying to get a picture of a horse's daily life. And every 15 minutes that we were in the yards, we basically recorded what the horses were doing. And in each yard, it was different in that first kind of study. In terms of the number of horses that we looked at, so depending on what size of yard and things like that. And we basically recorded every 15 minutes what the horses were doing during the daytime, basically. So we were there from about around 8 o'clock in the morning to about 7 o'clock in the evening. So it was kind of daytime. And we didn't do the sort of overnight thing, but I'd love to do that at another time. And basically to get a snapshot of what the horses were doing. And it was a real privilege, to be honest, to be able to spend that amount of time looking at how horses spent their day and how they behaved whenever all of the different things were happening in a typical, if there is such a thing, racing yard. Whether that was the busy times, whether that was the times whenever the yard was really quiet. And again, we were really lucky that there was only the two at times. There was maybe only me and Mathilde in the yard, and whenever the horses were resting and things like that, and how the behaviours changed depending on what was going on in the yard as well. So yeah, in terms of what an ideal life looks like, there was a big range in what we seen in terms of how horses were managed, how horses behaved, and a kind of the idea behind the project was to get a population level picture, I guess, of what welfare looked like, and that's kind of really, really important for the industry. But I think it's really important to think about individual horses as well. The population stuff is really important, and it can look at risk factors and look at where the industry's at. But it's really important to see and think about individual horses and how they're reacting and how they're experiencing their sort of time in training as well. And some horses will will cope differently, I suppose, in different situations. And in terms of ideal, we did see some absolutely fantastic management and trainers that were really looking at the individual horses and were putting them into different types of stables depending on what behaviours they were showing. We had numerous trainers that were turning horses out after exercise, before exercise, and to me, like, turnout is a massive part, I think, of racehorse welfare and of any horse welfare, really. And I get that it's really complex, and we speak about getting turnout and the 3 Fs and things, and people, trainers and other people that maybe don't turn horses out will question it and say, like, what about injuries? What about staff? We don't have the staff time to do it and things like that. And I totally get that. And having worked in racing yards, I totally get that. That's, it's competitive, it's hard. The staff, there's a staff shortage across the globe, kind of thing. But there's a lot of trainers that are doing it and doing it, really successfully. And I also, going back to the individual horse thing, like, I know that some people will say that, there's no way we could turn this particular horse out. Whether they might injure themselves, whether they might not settle if they're turned out. And I do get that, and I totally take it on board, but I don't think that should be a reason why they don't turn other horses out, for starters. I think you need to take each individual horse in its own sort of right. And I also would question, and it's hard to sort of say it if that's what you have in front of you, a horse that won't settle or a horse that, will run through the fence or whatever that is. But I would question, why that horse is doing that as well, and if it's something that's happened, like I said, about the early experiences, that if we could really sort of set the horses up a wee bit better with their earlier experiences, that turnout and being socialised with other horses isn't such a big deal and it's just normal. I think that would be really, really a really massive step forward across the board for the industry. But I, going from sort of flipping back and forward, I totally get that if a trainer has got a horse that they feel that they can't turn out for whatever reason, behaviourally or whatever that is, I do get that, and I know that it's hard. And even from facility point of view, some of the trainers that we've spoken, or that we were in the yards, they don't have the facilities to turn horses out. They're in maybe older, beautiful, traditional stables, but that they really don't have, they don't have much turnout. And it's so we can't just sort of turn around tomorrow and say, okay, all racehorses need to be turned out. I think it needs to be done incrementally, and sort of support, the trainers, and even earlier on in the kind of horse's life, so that they're set up better, that they can be turned out. And that being said, we did. We've seen some really sort of not even innovative. These trainers wouldn't have said they were innovative, but some really good ideas in terms of turnout, that even in very small spaces, basically, that they've got small pens and things like that they just had decided they wanted to turn their horses out and they were going to kind of make it work, and that was in very small spaces. Some of the trainers that we were at had those little pens outside the stable block, so the horse could actually choose to go in or out. And even if for some trainers that were really restricted in space, they were trying to put horses out in kind of lunge pen, kind of corral kind of idea. And again, I get that that's not it's not ideal if we're talking about what the absolute ideal is, but it's certainly better than standing in their stable all day. And I think it's about trying to think of those little small things that we can make that potentially wouldn't be that hard to make those small changes. And then think about aspirationally where we would love to be in terms of if it's 10 years, 20 years, whatever that is, to kind of try and think of the small things that trainers can do right now that would make a big difference to the individual horse, basically. And other things, I think, in terms of I think some other things that we can do from kind of a small change that would make probably a big difference to the individual horse too, would be social contact in the stable as well. So the research that we done, we found that about half of the horses that was in our data set had at least sniff contact when stabled, which was actually much better than what we thought and what was kind of in the literature previously. So in the first study that we done, it was just under half, and in the second study it was just over half. So that was really positive in terms of that they did have sniff contact whenever they were stabled. But on the flip side of that, I suppose there's 50% of horses that don't have, that have either only visual or no social contact. And again, if we try to think about what the absolute best would be, it would be that it's sort of more than that sniff contact. So, and some racehorse trainers did have that, they had horses in kind of pens with low walls, and horses could mutually groom each other. And one racehorse trainer actually removed the panels in the stables from whenever we were there, sort of at the start of the season and again at the peak of the season, and without any kind of intervention from us or even conversation almost about this. I think he had just sort of thought about it himself basically, but he had basically removed the panels in some of his horses' stables basically, so they actually could mutually groom each other while they were stabled, which was just fantastic. And I think there are small things like that can that would make a big difference to the horse and wouldn't be overly hard for racehorse trainers to do. And we know that for horses to really sort of form really good social bonds, they actually need to have that head and neck contact. So even though sniff contact is good, that they can sniff other horses between the bars, head and neck is really what we would be kind of aspiring to, if not even more than that. And again, me flipping back between, sort of my welfare and my practicality in the racing yard kind of thing. We have racehorse trainers that obviously respiratory infections are a big issue, that they want to keep their horses as healthy as possible. And that's a big, thing for their respiratory tract if they're picking up respiratory infections from each other. And that's one of the reasons why racehorse trainers maybe don't allow as much social contact as we might like. But again, we actually found in both of the populations of horses that we looked at that increased social contact didn't have any increase in nasal discharge. So that was a really kind of nice finding as well that we can kind of put out to racehorse trainers to give them a wee bit of confidence, I suppose, to kind of improve or increase that amount of social contact that the horses can have. And yeah, going back to the kind of, the 3 F's that we talk about of friends, forage and freedom. And I love it as a concept because I think it's really simple, but on the flip side of it, I know that it's complex to try and sort of fit that into kind of a regimented routine and things like that as well, in terms of, increase in social contact, increase in turnout. Forage, to be fair, I think is definitely improving in the racing industry. In terms of the 3 F's, I know whenever I was at college, like that it was a massive thing that racehorses were not fed as much forage as they needed, for sure. And I think the issues around gastric ulcers have really made trainers think a little bit more about increasing forage basically in the racehorse's diet to try and decrease the prevalence of ulcers. And again, in the research we done in the second study that we looked at, we found that over 80% of the horses had forage at the time of assessment. So that again was a really positive note in terms of what I was expecting in terms of the result, and definitely what's sort of presented in the literature as well. And I get that the welfare assessment was taken, at a snapshot as such. But again, I think we definitely need to take it as a positive because it's definitely more than what I was expecting in terms of racehorses having forage at a point in time kind of thing.
So just with your description of the little pens and things that trainers might have had to allow horses the opportunity to get out some turnout, one of the things that's growing, I think, around in many parts of the world are track systems for horses. Mm-hmm. I was just curious, did you see any of those in your travels, particularly for people with small spaces? Because sometimes they can work quite well in a small space.
Yeah. I haven't seen one in a pure racing yard as such, but we actually have what we call an active turnout at CAFRE in Enniskillen. And our racehorses do go out into it. We are really pleased basically with we call it an active turnout, but it's kind of like a track system where it's basically on hard standing, and there's different feeding stations and shelters and water. And originally we had put it in more for our equitation horses actually, and to try and get them to move a wee bit more in terms of managing their weight. But we also use it for the racehorses, and find it fantastic for those for both sets of horses. And again, I didn't see anything like that in particular for in a racing yard as such, but from what we've seen at CAFRE, we're very, very pleased with it. And we've also found that like again, sort of track systems or any kind of turnout systems, we've actually had less accident reports with students and things, but just because they've got that bit more turnout. And yeah, I think the track system or any kind of active turnout, they're definitely sort of gaining a lot more traction now. And as you say, they can be a really good addition, even in small spaces or around the end of, around the outside of a field or whatever that is. They can be really, really good, and especially in Fermanagh, where CAFRE's based, it's very, very wet, and we had struggled to really get enough turnout for the racehorses and for the equitation horses. So it's really been it's changed our whole management basically of those horses, being able to get them out regardless of the weather, because it's on hard standing and they've got shelters and they're rugged up and everything. But yeah, I'd be a huge advocate of any kind of track system or active turnout kind of system.
Rachel, you mentioned staff a couple of times, the importance of having enough staff, and I'm particularly interested in kind of horse-human interactions and relationships, because I think they play a big part in providing good welfare for horses. Did you look at that within your studies?
Yeah, we done what was the human reactivity test with the horses that we looked at. It's a measure that is used across different species, including horses, and has validated to kind of have links with welfare. And it's basically about an unknown human approaching the horse, and there's 3 stages to it. So it's kind of approaching the stable door if the horse is stabled, standing at the horse's door, and then going into the stable and making contact with the horse on the shoulder, and then recording whether those reactions were positive, negative, avoidance, ambiguous. Some horses maybe weren't so sure, and then were happy enough for the human to approach them. And again, we found the majority of horses showed positive reactions whenever we done those tests with them. And there was some differences whenever we looked at sort of in the peak time of the season. There was actually less positive reactions, and actually for the older horses there was less positive reactions as well. So our flat horses and our younger horses did show more positive reactions. And across the board it was, I think, about 70% of horses were showing positive reactions. But I think staff is probably one of the biggest impacts on horse welfare, to be honest, because they're sort of, they're dealing with the horse day in, day out. And I think it's really, really important to have staff that are, experienced and have a sort of a horse-centered outlook as well. And I know like it can be rushed and things in a racing yard at times if they don't have enough staff. And I think that is something that is tricky basically for trainers and the industry across the board to kind of negotiate. But yeah, I feel like there is a huge amount of really good horse people in the racing industry. Obviously not, you're always going to get exceptions, but I feel like there's a lot of really good experienced horse people, and I've worked with some of them, and I feel like that can make such a massive impact. And even kind of from a leadership point of view across the yard, some of the yards that we went into had just such a really nice kind of atmosphere. The staff took a bit more time with the horses. There was just a much more relaxed, there was no kind of rushing around, no shouting anything like that, and I just felt like the whole atmosphere in the yard and the horses did seem to be a lot more sort of calmer as well. I can't emphasize enough the impact that staff can have on individual horses, and I think from a kind of an ideal kind of world as well, like we would be trying to think around having staff that the horse knows and is familiar to the horse as well, and kind of that the staff can pick up any kind of behaviors or things that it wouldn't be quite normal for that horse. I think that's really important both from a health point of view and from a welfare point of view, and even from a riding point of view as well. Going back to your question, Karen, that if you have a rider that is well suited to that particular horse and can understand that horse, then it's much more predictable for the horse, and they know what to expect, and that obviously that they're a sympathetic and good rider, and that can make a big difference to the horse on a daily basis as well.
One of the questions that I had, Rachel, about your study, congratulations, I think it was a great study.
Thank you.
Was you did the human reactivity test, which showed a difference between the start and the end of the season. You also looked at the horse grimace scale. Did you look at whether there was a relationship between the reactivity tests and the grimace scale?
Yeah, we did look at that, and we didn't find any associations between the two. But yeah, there were two really interesting measures that were part of the welfare assessment. The horse grimace scale is really interesting in terms of it's basically looking at like the tension that's held in the horse's face as an indicator of pain. Done it for both our populations of horses. So we looked at racehorses. In the first study, it was like over 350 horses, and then in the industry study, it was over 700 horses. And both of those populations, we measured the horse grimace scale on each of the horses, and across the board, we found that scores were low. So on a scale of 0 to 12, the average was between 2 and 3 in both those populations of horses. And it's kind of a sort of one of those measures that's a little bit tricky. The other interesting thing that we found was that there was an increase, a statistical increase, significant increase in whenever we looked at the same horses at the beginning of the season and the peak of the season, which is really certainly very interesting, but it's still on the lower scale, the lower end of that scale. And the other thing that we found about the horse grimace scale is that it was, whenever we were training the industry assessors, it was the one measure that they didn't feel completely comfortable and confident in carrying out. So while we feel that there's something interesting about that measure and about that result, it's kind of one of those things that we need to look a bit deeper into it, basically. And the other thing to mention is that it was validated on acute pain, so looking at horses that had that were being castrated, and some in another study that had laminitis. So it was validated on acute pain, and I kind of think that we probably need to look at something that's maybe more of a chronic pain score. So yeah, it gave us loads of kind of discussion, I guess, and loads of, scratching our heads of what it means kind of thing. And we've kind of decided that, it's one that we need to look a bit deeper in, or maybe use a slightly different measure in terms of whenever we did. And I think it's really important that whenever we were training the assessors that went out and assessed the 700 racehorses, the feedback we got from them was that it was the one thing that they just weren't confident in. So that's something that I think we need to take that on board and maybe use a different measure.
Did they sort of talk about why they weren't confident? Like what aspect of it they weren't confident about?
Just that they felt like they weren't sure what they were looking at, kind of thing. And whenever we trained them, so we trained 16 assessors to carry out the welfare assessment. And whenever in the training, we spent a long time doing it, and they did feel like once the training was done, like they felt at that stage happy, but whenever they actually went out into industry and done it, they just they felt they weren't completely sure at what they were kind of looking at, and that they would either like more training on it, or it was kind of the only measure that they weren't happy with, basically. So yeah, we kind of need to look again at that one, I suppose, and think about something, because one of the most important things in terms of welfare assessment in other species, so especially in the farm animal species, is that assessors, need to be confident in what they are obviously sort of recording and assessing. So we've kind of taken that on board and kind of removed that part of the assessment, for now anyway.
I can absolutely empathise. Excuse me. I can absolutely empathise with your assessors, because I find the horse Grimace scale really difficult to apply. I'm interested in the whole idea of having assessors carrying out assessments, and I'm also interested in whether it sounds great in theory. We have a welfare assessment tool and we're going to deploy it, but is there a pass fail? Is this going to be a stick to beat people with, or is this something that they can actually use to incrementally improve what they do? And also, how do you assign scores to different aspects of the protocol? Are the behavioural tests more important than the provisions of windows or grills or turnout or whatever it might be? The kind of, I know we're not the only ones grappling with this. The same is true in farm animal species as well. I'm just wondering how you approach this aspect of it.
Yeah, and it's a really good question. And whenever I started the project, I was like, I hadn't a clue what a welfare assessment was, to be honest. It does feel a bit abstract, I think, until you kind of go out and try to do it. Whenever we first tried to do it, we were like, we'd love to do everything, but that's not practical. There isn't no pass or fail in it, and we haven't assigned scores to this welfare assessment either. And we've taken on board, there's a huge amount of research and evidence, particularly in the farm animal species, around welfare assessment. And they have found basically that applying a score just doesn't really reflect the welfare status of the animal, basically, because if you're scoring really highly in one area and really lowly in another area, then you could end up in the middle, and that doesn't really give you a genuine picture of what that animal's welfare looks like. So we haven't included a score with that for that reason. In terms of like weighting the measures and things like that, the gold standard of welfare assessment includes animal-based measures, so looking at what the animal is actually telling us about, about its own welfare and how how it's coping in its environment. So we have a range of animal-based measures, so things like the human reactivity test, things like body condition score, things like mouth corner lesions, all of those animal-based measures. And then we've got the resource-based measures, so things that we're providing, for the animal, basically. So things like the type of stable, how much turnout it gets, the training, whatever, any sort of management things. Again, I guess we can't we can't do one without the other. I think to have a completely animal-based assessment protocol would be really leaving out a massive part of the picture, basically. So I think it's really important to gather that information in terms of how the horse is managed and what resources we provide for it. But I guess what the animal is telling us about the welfare is probably is what we call the gold standard across the board. What the welfare assessment was developed for racehorses was really to look at a population level data, so to try and look at across the board where the challenges were and where welfare is good, and where what should be applauded and rolled out across the board. So it was definitely not a pass or fail, but trying to get a picture or a baseline, I guess, of where we are in terms of welfare, and then look at where the challenges are and where we need to improve, really. Like as I said, there's lots of things that we found that was really good and were positive and, better than we thought, but there's definitely areas that we think are really important to kind of improve across the industry. Things like, stereotypical behaviour, for example, across the industry. That's not something that an individual trainer can fix. Once a horse is presenting those kind of behaviours, they're not going to be able to change that. But as an industry sort of baseline, we could try and improve, lessen the prevalence of stereotypical behaviour across the board. Things like mouth corner lesions, for example, or tack lesions. We can look at where we are and try and educate and just even shine a sort of a bit of a torch on certain areas that we could focus on as an industry to improve across the board. Like I said, the amount of turnout and social contact, things like that. It's more about kind of trying to influence human behaviour change probably more than anything else, and try and sort of think, this is where we are, this is what we have found, these things are good, but we could improve, these things are not good, and we need to really look at see how we can improve them across the board as an industry. So it definitely was never developed to kind of be a stick to beat trainers or anybody with kind of thing. And I think it's really just about trying to highlight where we need to focus our attention really, more than anything else. And the racehorse trainers that we spoke to were really interested and on board with it, and we want to be sort of transparent, and we want this, this is what we're doing, and very open to kind of really interested in the results and what we found. And obviously at the very beginning they were a bit kind of dubious and kind of what are you people coming in here to our yard kind of thing. But once we had a conversation with them, basically they were very welcoming, and as they let us sort of observe the horses, whenever at lunchtime and things like that, they were very happy and really kind of interested. And I think they're aware of, and even more so now, obviously this was done a couple of years ago now, but very aware of the kind of social license aspect. I feel like they want to be transparent and sort of say that this is how we're managing our horses, and very kind of open to us to being in there and recording things.
Sort of going back to that blue sky sort of not perfect day, but a great day for a racehorse. One of the things, as you well know, with welfare is providing opportunities for positive experiences as well as just removing the negative. I'm just wondering, was that sort of part of what you were looking at, or was that sort of thing something that was discussed when you were doing your research, Rachel?
We included things obviously like turnout and forage and things like that, but we're looking at positive elements of welfare kind of more so kind of now. I think we were trying to get a baseline of what the picture looks like, and I think now we're definitely trying to think about what positive experiences that we can kind of add into a racehorse's life. Like even like going back to kind of the small things that you could include in terms of even like things like a peck of grass and things like that for racehorses that don't have any access to turnout, for example. And it's all about that kind of like the positive welfare balance, that if we can increase the amount of positive experiences that a horse has across the board, any horse, we can bring it into that sort of positive welfare balance. And I'm not saying that a peck of grass is, the same as having turnout with a group of friends by any means, but I think it's about trying to introduce those kind of positive experiences that racehorses and horses can have. And I think it's all about those sort of incremental changes that trainers can think about and introduce and lead to kind of those bigger changes. And like, I guess if we think about what the ideal life of a racehorse or the day of a racehorse would involve, it would involve, a training regime or exercise that was like suited to its, you know, physical and mental sort of stage in training. It would include a rider that was, you know, experienced and very horse centered. It would include you know, feedstuffs and lots of forage, but maybe even a choice of different types of forages. And it would include, obviously, you know, we've talked about a lot, but, you know, turnout and, you know, potentially turnout in groups as well. And I think if we had all of those things in place, you know, I think racehorses would have a good life. And there's lots of racehorses that are providing those things for racehorses. So I do think it's possible, and I think it's about trying to spread the word really and give trainers confidence about turning horses out or whatever the thing is that they feel that, you know, they aren't able to do, but to kind of say, well, this guy has done it, and I know the horses aren't the exact same or whatever, but you know, and he's doing it and he's not having any issues, and he's, you know, enjoying that, being able to manage horses in that way. And I think it's about thinking, you know, and even getting, you know, trainers to sort of, you know, talk to each other about things like that. One of the early parts of our project was actually was like a focus group with stakeholders, and we spoke to racehorse trainers about actually what, you know, what the best life of a racehorse looks like. And we had, you know, some fantastic conversations. But one of the conversations was like we had a group of racehorse trainers, and you know, one racehorse trainer just could not fathom that another person that was sitting across the table from him was turning his horses out in groups on a daily basis. And he was like, they just couldn't understand that this was happening, and it was not 100, you know, not far away from each other. And so I think that's really helpful to spread that. You know, we might call them innovative, but like those racehorse trainers don't think of them as innovative. They just think of them as the way that they manage their horses. But it's about trying to highlight the, you know, good practices and best practices, and try and sort of roll that out across the board.
Do you think there are opportunities to have, like, create situations for trainers to have those conversations outside of like a research setting? Because it seems to me, like, and I think we've had this conversation recently about creating these opportunities for people to talk to each other, and in a way that in a forum that's non-threatening, and it's just and I don't know, is there opportunities like when people are at the races, or I don't know, I don't go. It's a different world to me.
I think I think that would be absolutely fantastic, and I would love to see that basically. I think that it is competitive. Obviously, they're in competition with each other, and it's, you know, it's all about marginal gains, and, you know, but that being said, I think welfare is something that is actually non-competitive, that they could discuss quite openly, and it's not about how much exercise they're getting or you know, things like that. It's a conversation that could be had that isn't sort of the competition side of it doesn't really come into it. So I don't think there is, you know, any sort of space for that. I don't think the races is necessarily the place for it. But I think that would be an absolutely fantastic opportunity, and it would be just great to see. I know, again, going back to some of the other like species, and like I know farmers do that on quite a regular basis. They have, you know, like business development groups, and they have kind of farm innovation visits, and they have like focus farms and things like that they go on to see what other farmers are doing and to learn peer to peer. So it is happening in other industries, and yeah, like I would absolutely love to see more of that. I think that would be a really, really positive step to kind of promote the things that, you know, that we're doing really well, and also to talk about the things that are hard, you know, as well, you know, in a safe space. How can we, you know, for those harder questions and the bigger challenges, that if it was sort of in a safe space, that trainers could actually, you know, discuss it out and sort of think about, get ideas from each other as well. I think that would be fantastic.
Yeah, like I guess the risk is you get a group that reinforces each other's ideas, and then you know what I mean? You
Yeah.
sort of have to have that balance, don't you, of someone amongst the group to sort of push the thinking, you know, outside of just what everyone's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I suppose
Yeah.
if it was, you know, like if it was facilitated, it could be, you know, very much open, you know, very much their group as such, but facilitated to kind of show, um, you know, both sides of it, I suppose, as you say, to stop that kind of like echo chamber that I know is, I think that's probably, you know, one of the things that we struggle with in the racing industry, that we're all kind of talking to each other all of the time and it's just an echo. And I would think to kind of step outside that would be really, really positive, and just see what else is going on kind of thing would be really, really good.
Back when you answered Karen's question about whether you looked at aspects of positive welfare, and you said that that was then and now there's more discussion about that, I think that might be part of the answer to this question, because I think if you are trying to promote positive welfare, it straight away people's hackles stay down. They say, oh, positive welfare, I like the sound of that. So you're already on the front foot. Whereas when you're talking about the, you know, what's bad, you know, that we're trying to improve, but what's good that we're trying to make better. I think that's a really powerful thing for people, because everyone wants to be involved in something positive. So I think there really could be something in sort of some sort of a peer-to-peer. Yes, it probably does need some facilitation, but in a respectful way, because they are the experts. You know, we're you know, we're just kind of guiding in a very general sense, but they have the lived experience day on day. I'm just going back to the protocol, Rachel, for a second. I'm just wondering, I mean, I was fascinated by it because it was based in UK racing yards, which of course are very similar in their setup to Ireland. So you know, a lot of what was in there resonated with me. But I'm just wondering about rollout. I mean, are other jurisdictions looking at your work? Is there any uptake? You know, just that benchmark, or that could be established worldwide.
Yeah, so we've had lots of interest really from different sort of jurisdictions across around the world really, which has been fantastic. And the Hong Kong Jockey Club have actually did trial it, and they looked at they used the full protocol basically and looked at comparing horses in different settings. Basically, they have a facility in China and one in Hong Kong, and they were really, you know, happy with how it worked for them, and it sort of again shone a light on different aspects of management and how the horses were coping. It's also been used with the military working horses in London, and they are rolling it out as well as a kind of a management tool, basically to kind of just basically to monitor welfare, again looking at what's good, to see, you know, what's highlight areas that need to be improved as well. And we are also talking to some of the jurisdictions in Australia as well, that are really keen to kind of develop it. And it's, you know, it's quite a flexible protocol. You know, it's not sort of set in stone as such. You know, it's not going to work for every single jurisdiction. You know, everyone is different sort of setups and things, and it's something, you know, there are parts of it, like for example for the military we added in certain measures that were kind of key to them, you know, areas that they wanted to particularly focus on, you know, and that could definitely happen, you know, that if there's a certain thing or a certain aspect of welfare that people wanted to look at, then, you know, we can look and see what measures could be included in it. So yeah, we're and we've also done work in New Zealand as well with Winning Form, in terms of developing sort of an app in terms of the welfare protocol. But yeah, we have an interest, and it's very flexible in terms of what can be kind of used in it, depending on what the objective of the welfare assessment is, I guess, you know, whether it's looking at a population or whether if people wanted to look at more on a sort of an individual basis, it's really key to kind of think about what you actually want to get out of it, and then sort of tweak it basically to make sure it sort of meets your objective.
I'd love to just ask you a little. So we've been in a racing yard, and the morning times are hectic. to go, go, go. And then things settle down, exercise is over, horses are back. I'm just interested in the rest and sleep aspect. I just think that's fascinating, and some of your findings of your work really I just thought, yeah, this is the sort of stuff trainers should hear about, because it's simple but so important. We all know what we feel like after a good night's sleep.
Yeah. And there is sort of a bit of increase in research in sleep in horses, but there's not a massive amount of work out there. But we know from the human athlete sort of side of things that sleep is absolutely like fundamental to performance. And we would guess that it would be the same for horses as well. In terms of rest, it's obviously really, really important. And we found we as I say, we didn't look at horses overnight, which I would love to do it at a separate stage, but we did look at horses in that sort of mid time, sort of lunchtime, that a lot of racing yards are a lot quieter. And again, there was a real variability in terms of horses that we seen lying down. So we know that horses can only get that REM sleep whenever they're lying recumbently on their side. And there was a variability between yards that we went into, that we seen in some yards we seen lots of horses lying down, in other yards we seen no horses lying down in that daytime space. One of the yards that we went into, it actually had these floor to ceiling bars between the stables, so there was no solid panel as such, and that was down through an entire barn. And at lunchtime, whenever we were doing the behavioural observations in that particular yard, there was just a full line of maybe 8 young horses just lying flat out sleeping, basically, from top to bottom. And as I say, it was such a privilege to be there, kind of, and we were obviously very quiet doing our behavioural observation. But yeah, we didn't see that in any other yard, that the entire kind of barn was lying down sleeping. And again, we guess that is probably because that these floor to ceiling bars, they can actually see each other from when they're lying down. And again, there's research to show that horses feel safer if they can see another horse whenever they're lying down. So yeah, it was a really fantastic part of our behavioural observations. And the other thing that was really good that came out of the models that we ran, in terms of all of the different sort of factors, was that we found that horses that had physical social contact were more likely to lie down recumbently, again, which is kind of a great piece of evidence, I guess, to kind of promote that increase in social contact. So the horses that could have at least sniff contact were statistically more likely to basically lie down recumbently at some stage during the behavioural observation. And again, as you say, Mita, that whenever we know how important rest is for athletes, so if we can kind of improve that rest period to improve performance, and do that by increasing social contact, which is also good for welfare, then it's kind of bringing the whole thing together, really, which would be fantastic.
Just curious, Rachel, I was listening to a webinar the other day, and I think it was a Danish presenter talking about stable size and stables being big enough for horses to be actually able to lie down properly. I'm just curious, what's sort of the average size of the stables that you were seeing in your study?
Yeah, most of them were your traditional kind of, your traditional sort of normal size of boxes. But we did have a couple of the kind of older stables that did have some small stables, and then we also had some yards that had quite big pens, almost like solid floor, but almost like a cattle pen, and they had kind of a lot of space actually. The majority of them were just the traditional loose box size. But there has definitely been research, as you say, to show that, especially for bigger horses, that it's really, really important that they feel able to lie down, but also to get up as well. So some horses that are in smaller stables, will be reluctant to lie down because they'll feel that they might not be able to get up again. So that's a really important factor, particularly for larger horses. And in terms of stable size, one of the other things that we noticed that trainers were actually putting horses that had some were showing some stereotypical behavior. They were actually putting horses into kind of different types of stables. So maybe the bigger type of pen stable, some of those, they were basically thinking about what can we do to kind of improve the lived experience of these horses. And we know that we aren't going to be able to stop them performing these stereotypical behaviors, but at least if we can give them, like, maybe with 2 windows or a different view. And they were definitely thinking about what they could do to kind of improve the stable environment for those particular horses as well. The other thing that, in terms of stable design, that came out of the work that we done, was that stable or windows are really important for horses in stables. So whenever we were doing the behavioural observations, we thought, we commented to each other, myself and Matilde, were like, they really enjoying the windows. If they've got a window, they'll use the window basically, and they'll stand and look out through it. And again, we found that was something that was statistically significant as well, that basically if they did have a window, that they would use it, and that it is important part of, I suppose, increasing their visual stimulation, that if they are stable, that they do have a kind of a view or something to look at, and found that was a really important thing. And again, if you're building new stables or something, it could be something that could be really important to include when you're developing new stables and new facilities.
No, I just said you could also just get the jackhammer out if you don't have windows and maybe see if you could make some.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of those small things, I think, just about thinking slightly differently, or thinking about what is actually important to the horse. You don't have to wait until you're building new stables. You can just make changes that would improve that horse's experience.
Do you think we'll ever see a day where people move away from stables altogether? Because we know that stabling is not really conducive to the best horse welfare. Do you think that there'll be a day where people will come up with a different way of managing race horses that doesn't involve stabling?
I think it's a long way from where we are at the minute, but I do know of trainers that do train race horses out from the field, that they are as competitive as other horses, so I think that it is possible for some horses, and I know, in New Zealand, when I worked in New Zealand for a while, and they train a lot of their race horses from the yards, or from outside basically. So yeah, I think it is possible. Again, you have to think about the individual horse. Some horses would not enjoy kind of out in the middle of really wet weather and things like that. But I think if we can provide shelters, and think about that, it's not a one size fits all for all horses. I think we have to remember that as well. It's okay to say that friends, forage and free, or turn out in great groups is the absolute goal. But for some individual horses, that's not going to have their best welfare. But I do think that it is possible to train race horses from the field or from outside. Yeah, but I think it's not a one size fits all.
Rachel, in this Changing Rein studio, we have a genie, and she can grant any wish your heart desires. And there's no constraints, there's no problem with resources, anything you would like. And since we're about, I suppose, the sustainability of horse sport, what would be your one wish for that, or what would be the one wish you would ask of that genie to make sure we can enhance and sustain horse sport?
I think, like, from a racing point of view and from a kind of a managing racehorses, and if this genie is um, so good that there's no resource element or anything, I think it would be that, there was some level of turnout for racehorses, I think, and I'm caveating that with it's not going to suit every single horse, but if this genie could go back to those horses' early experiences and set them up to be able to, to be turned out with, well socialized as a youngster, be resilient and all, could go back to those early experiences, that all racehorses would be able to and enjoy a level of turnout, I guess, as part of their training and management routine. I think that would be fabulous.
Yeah, I do wonder and worry sometimes that there's a kind of a disconnect between breeding and rearing of young horses and what they're actually going to be doing. So yeah, I think how they're managed, socialized in their formative years has a huge impact on how they're going to be as racehorses. And we all want to breed winners. We all, and so maybe one of the ways of helping that um, is to make sure that we play our part as breeders back in the horses' early days. So yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, there's definitely something in that, and it's, I suppose, a bit of a supply chain kind of thing, and it's not something that's going to be fixed overnight. But I think if we can kind of do a bit of behavior change work maybe in those, and getting everybody kind of on the same page. And I get it, as well, like a lot of the breeders and horses that are going through the sales, they've, quite regimented regimes and things like that as well. And it's difficult, but I think that I think, yeah, I think we could set them up a little bit better, sort of across the board. And then even whenever, whenever they retire from racing, then I think as well, if they've had those really good early experiences, they can be easier to rehome. They're less likely to have stereotypical behaviour, which we know again makes them harder to rehome. So I think it's all really interconnected. And I think we do need to kind of step back and see where we can sort of make the small changes right now, but also step back and think about where could we be in whatever that length of time is, is it 20 years, 30 years, whatever that is. But we could sort of start to implement changes there that would make big differences overall as well.
Yeah, both Karen and I are interested in systems thinking, and one of the big things in systems thinking is identifying leverage points where a small change can make a big difference downstream. And there are certainly some there, particularly back in the early stages, that could be really powerful forces for change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we've talked about too, Meta, is weaning. How horses are weaned often has a really big impact on how they behave and cope in future sort of stressful situations. So that's another thing that sort of fits into that whole
Yeah, absolutely.
element.
And again, I think one of the other things that is really difficult for trainers is like turning out colts as well. So turning out entire male horses. And I get that could be real, that's probably not something as it stands that they can do basically because they haven't had that opportunity to kind of build those social relationships. But I think again, if we were setting them up differently in the first place, then that would be less of a kind of a barrier of turning out those flat horses too.
Yeah. Rachel, this has been fascinating. I mean, obviously, it's a topic very dear to my heart, and I've really enjoyed our discussion, which has gone in different places and different directions, but lots of food for thought. And I'm coming away very energized and with a positive frame of mind, because I think there's huge scope for the future to implement both your protocol, but also to get trainers thinking about some of those small changes that can actually make a big difference.
Yeah, I think it's really, like, I could talk about racehorses all day basically, but I think it is about making things practical and applied. That's kind of my main thing in terms of trying, making the difference where it's actually going to make a difference, and having things that aren't kind of like in the office, they sound great, but whenever you're actually out standing in front of 20 or 30 horses, then it's, not achievable. So I think it's really important to be practical and sort of think about how it's going to work in real life, really, because otherwise you're not going to go anywhere basically.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rachel. I've really enjoyed our conversation too. So thanks so much for coming on Changing Rein. It's been great.